Hi, welcome to this lecture on race and racism. This lecture continues our discussion of the ways in which biology and culture interact. But as we'll see, in this case, the relation between the two is a bit different than the ones we've considered before. We typically understand race as a biological concept, dividing humanity into discrete biologically defined groups. However, despite some remaining holdouts, it's generally now believed among both biologists and social scientists like anthropologists that biological race does not exist. However, this does not mean that race is not real. Rather, it means we have to understand it very differently, as a social and cultural construction. In particular, anthropologists understand race as a culturally defined way of classifying people. Different cultures classify all sorts of different things: time, space, animals, plants, and people in different ways. Race, like kinship, which we'll talk about soon, is a method by which certain cultures classify people or divide them into groups. In our culture, this system of classification is not just one of difference, but also one of hierarchy. Either explicitly or implicitly, people of different races have been viewed and or treated as superior or inferior. Race has served as a principle upon which access to various social, economic, and political resources has been unequally distributed. So race is about power and difference. In this lecture, we'll first discuss why various scholars reject the idea that race has any valid basis in biology. Second, we'll discuss how it works as a system of difference and as a principle of social hierarchy and inequality. The idea that race is biologically real has traditionally had four elements. First, humans can be divided into a few categories. Second, these categories are fixed and they're old. Third, behavior is associated with race. And fourth, there is a hierarchy of races. Over the past decades, ideas number 3 and 4 have fallen out of favor and are typically no longer explicitly articulated except among self-avowed white supremacists. That said, they may be embraced by more people in an unconscious or unspoken way. However, the first two ideas are still fairly widespread and form the premise of the arguments of those who still argue race has a biological basis. Let's consider those two ideas in more detail. In the discussion prompt for today, I asked you to answer questions about how many races there are and how you identify them. Shown on this slide are the typical answers I get when I do this exercise in class. I want you to note a couple of things about this. First, there's disagreement about how many races there are and what they are. Moreover, the categories we use are of different kinds. For instance, Black is a term that describes an international and diasporic group of people who are defined by the common experience of being descended from enslaved people. African American, on the other hand, is a category that includes people in the United States of African origin, either recently or further back in time. The category of Asian includes everyone from people in the Middle East to people in the Far East. Ultimately, Asian refers to the continent people originate from, rather than a shared biological background per se. Note also that the characteristics we typically use to distinguish races are of different sorts. Some are heritable biological traits, like skin color, but others, food, music, culture, and geographic origin, are not. So we're mixing apples and oranges here. This category of race then seems like a kind of complex category, one that has cultural as well as biological elements. Even if we only consider biological characteristics, we need to ask if it's really so easy to distinguish people of different races. To get at this, I had you do the sorting exercise on PBS Television's excellent Race, Power of an Illusion website. Usually students have a surprisingly hard time with this exercise. Why is it so hard? The problem is that we assume that the physical differences that constitute racial categorization are covariant. That is, they come together in a bunch. If you have one of these physical characteristics, you're likely to have another. That's the assumption. But in fact, these characteristics generally are non-concordant, which means they don't vary or come together. There may be some covariance at the local level, which gives us what we typically call ethnicity, or what scientists call populations, but not at the scale as large as would be necessary to divide humanity into 4 or 5 biologically defined races. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of ethnicities and populations. Crucially, skin color, which we see as so important to race in the United States, does not vary along with physical variations in any significant way. In fact, there is more biological variation within each race, defined by skin color, than between them. The website illustrates this very well. For more on this, go back to the exercise we did, click on Explore Diversity, and then on Physical Appearance. Then click around to see a clear explanation of how these traits that are typically understood as making up race do not vary together. In any case, it doesn't seem that it is in fact easy to distinguish racial categories. Certainly harder than it should be if these categories were only biological. So let's look at another component of the idea of biological race, the idea that racial categories are fixed and old. First, there's this problem. While the traits that are said to constitute race as a biological reality can be measured, they are distributed continuously, that is to say, on a continuum. Thus, the cutoffs that separate races, for example in skin color, are completely arbitrary. In the US, the continuum of skin tone is usually divided into 3 broader categories that more or less are associated with white, black, and Latino people. But many more categories of skin color are possible. Makeup artists know this. And in fact, these skin tones are multidimensional, varying not just on lightness or darkness, but color as well. As a preschooler, one of my kids had 2 teachers with the same last name, one of whom identified as white and the other identified as black. However, my son distinguished them in a different way. There was his pink teacher and his brown teacher. His categories didn't correspond with the arbitrary categories that make up the biological idea of race as determined by skin color in the US. Moreover, there's often overlap. You probably know light-skinned people who identify as black and people whose skin is relatively dark who may identify as white. Thus, how we understand the biological differences that are thought to undergird the concept of race itself influenced by cultural considerations. How we categorize color, for instance, or skin tone. Another problem with the idea that racial categories are fixed and old is that race has been classified differently over time and space. Take the article about race in Brazil. There, race is defined more by appearance than in the United States, where historically it was established by heredity or blood. Likewise, in South Africa, home of apartheid and historically an extremely race-conscious and unequal society, there is a fourfold racial division. There are whites, who are Europeans, blacks, who are native Africans of many different ethnicities, Indians, who are people from India, but also Malaysia, and then coloreds, who are people of African and either European or South Asian descent. In the United States, of course, the white-black divide is crucial, though Latinos and Asians are also important racial groups. These different systems of racial classification reflect particular histories that involve colonization, enslavement, the movement of people around the globe, the organization of labor, as in plantations, and so on. We'll learn more about this in terms of the US in a moment, but I'd be happy to talk about the historical specificities of this in terms of South Africa and Brazil, if you'd like, in the discussion period. In general, the modern Western idea of race developed in the context of colonization and exploration. It was invented as a supposedly scientific way to classify different peoples in the 16th and 7th centuries, and then was solidified in the 18th and 19th century. It drew on certain aspects of Christian belief, of pseudoscience, and of early notions of cultural evolutionism to establish a strict hierarchy between races, with the position of lower races justified by their supposedly biologically determined characteristics and behavior. These two quotes from the anthropologist Audrey Smedley's book, Race, History of an Idea, really get at this point. I'd pause the video for a moment here and read them. In the US, this took a particular form. Here, blood or descent became the defining way in which race was defined. This was due to slavery, as it allowed the population of slaves to be maintained despite interbreeding between black slaves and non-slaves, which was quite common. Thus, anyone with a parent or grandparent or sometimes great-grandparent who was a black slave was considered black and thus eligible to be enslaved. In fact, in the US, the idea of race as a biological reality followed slavery, not the other way around. How did this work? Well, early America had a labor problem. Not enough people were willing to work when there was so much land that they could use to be independent. They didn't want to work for other people if they could work for themselves. First attempts to deal with this involved indentured servitude of Europeans, as well as various forms of forced and induced Native American labor. But neither was sufficient. The enslavement of African peoples, which was already happening though on a very small scale, provided an answer to this labor problem, albeit a terribly violent and unjust one that's had terrible consequences. The idea of race developed around roughly 1700 to justify the use of slavery. If enslaved African people could be supposedly scientifically established as subhuman or of a different race than their white owners and exploiters, this would lessen the conflict between slavery and ideas about human equality, the idea that all people are equal, that we see enshrined in the US founding, that were emerging at the same time. Note that these systems of racial classification, which were first centered around the distinction between blacks, whites, and native people, became complicated with immigration and colonial conquest. This quote from the historians Michael Omi and Howard Wannot gets at this. As they note, previous to major waves of immigration in the 19th century, those considered white were a certain subset of Europeans, generally Anglo-Saxon Protestants from countries like Britain or Germany. With immigration, the category of whiteness expanded to include people from all of Europe, Southern Europeans like Italians or Greeks, Irish people, and Jews. It's interesting to note that some of these groups, Irish and Italians, for example, were not considered white when they first arrived. Only once they began moving up the socioeconomic ladder were they considered white. So economic status is very important here, as well as these political considerations of how to make sure that working class people of different backgrounds are essentially divided from each other rather than seeing each other as peers or equals. Indeed, one of the great fears of elites in the United States has been of cross-racial working class politics. Race has served to divide working class people from one another. There are other examples of this shifting in the category of whiteness that largely reflect class. For example, wealthy people who owned land in the western part of the United States, which was part of Mexico until the 19th century, were at the time considered white because of their elite landowning status. Over time, as the class composition of Mexicans in the United States has changed, they've essentially been moved out of the category of whiteness. The same was true of Middle Eastern people, particularly Muslims, after 9/11, with the rise of fears of Islamicist terrorism. So it's important to note that these racial categories, like that of whiteness, have shifted over time and are still shifting. It should be apparent that the first two aspects of the idea of biological race are false. The second two are rejected by the vast majority of people, at least in public. The notion that there is a hierarchy of races has been decisively rejected, as has the notion that biological race determines behavior in some straightforward way. However, that final aspect of the biological idea of race has been replaced by ideas about quote unquote culture that are often kind of a placeholder for biological race. Thus, it's unlikely that anyone will say in polite company that blacks have higher levels of unemployment than whites do because of biological differences. It's much more common for people to argue, erroneously, that black culture, quote unquote, does not emphasize work and achievement and thus explains differences in employment. This idea of race being associated with behavior has transformed, but still smuggles in racist ideas. In any case, if race is not a biological fact, then what is it? It is a social and cultural force. Our notion of race is a socially and historically constructed way of classifying people. That is to say, it's cultural. But it's more than this. It's a way of classifying people that has privileged the interests of some over others. That is to say, race is a social system of both difference and hierarchy. Thus, we have a multicultural idea of race that argues that we are all different and that each culture is equal and unique. This is a fine aspiration. However, it tends to underplay the second aspect of the socially and culturally constructed idea of race that involves hierarchy. Thus, in multiculturalism, white is an unmarked norm. We have African studies, Black History Month, but no white studies or White History Month. One of the ways in which our racial system has worked is to erase whiteness, to make it seem like the norm from which all other races are a departure. Indeed, as the white privilege article by McIntosh argues, one of the privileges of being white, especially if one is male and upper class, is not having to really think about race on an everyday basis. This has led to some tension, which emerges in the idea of color blindness. Arguments for color blindness are typically premised on the notion that individual level racism has declined and that the vast majority of white people do not consciously discriminate against black people. Although there is evidence for the continuing existence of this sort of individual level discrimination, for example, in the labor and housing markets, it is doubtlessly true that white people in the US are far, far less interpersonally racist in this way than in the recent past. The election of Barack Obama and the emergence of black celebrities like Oprah or LeBron are prime examples. So race is very complex. It's multiple. It works in many different ways. And it's a process. It changes over time. And one of the things anthropologists do is focus on these changes and on emergent and new forms of race, racism, and racialization. This means that even as there may be progress in some regards, there is not in others. And indeed, new forms of racial inequality might be emerging even now. For example, an income gap between similarly educated black and white people still exists, but has been closing. But there is still a huge gap in wealth, wealth meaning accumulated value in things like savings and houses, and this gap is crucial to the intergenerational maintenance of racial inequality. Wealth allows people to do things like start businesses and go to college, and thus to make more money. It also provides a fallback in hard times, during pandemics, or during health emergencies. Why hasn't this wealth gap closed? Racist practices of individual employers and real estate agents play a role, but the bigger problems are structural. What is the biggest source of wealth for most people? It's housing. And the historical effects of housing discrimination are very much still with us, even if that discrimination has lessened, though not disappeared. For a good illustration of how this works, see the PBS website again, and especially the Tale of Two Families link, which shows a great job of showing how both private and public discrimination by individuals, the real estate industry, and the federal government led to racial inequalities in access to home ownership over time, thus undermining the ability of Black people and Black families to accumulate wealth in the same way that white people have been able to. Another example of how structural racism works is described by Michelle Alexander in her work on criminal justice. Without going into a great amount of detail, Let me just say that she, along with many, many other scholars, has documented racial discrimination at every step of the criminal justice system, from how police interact with people on the street, to arrest rates for minor drug offenses, to sentencing levels. This is primarily driven by the so-called war on drugs that began in the 1970s. The upshot has been that despite similarities of rates of illegal drug use among different racial groups, blacks, and to a lesser degree Latinos, are far more likely to be incarcerated for drug crimes than whites. This is, of course, a major issue today, being addressed by Black Lives Matter and other movements aiming to decriminalize drug use and reform the criminal justice system. In any case, this is likely to have huge consequences in the future. People who have been incarcerated have a hard time getting loans, jobs, housing, and so on. Often they can't vote. They certainly earn less money and have a harder time moving their way up the social ladder than others. On the right of this slide, we see some evidence of this. On the top, we have a map of the United States showing states in which voting rights are taken away from felons. In the center, we have a bar graph showing the differences in earnings between people who have been incarcerated and those who have not been. And on the bottom, we have a graph showing the differences in percentages of children of different races who have a parent who's been incarcerated, a situation often associated with poor educational and career outcomes. All this will exacerbate racial inequality and have prolonged effects in the future. Thus, unfortunately, it's likely that in 50 years, racial inequalities will still remain, reproduced by these contemporary policies and their legacies. This is how structural racism continues, even if racism on a personal level is on the decline. We can have racism without a lot of racists. What I hope I've shown here is that while the biological idea of race is not valid, race as a cultural and social phenomenon still has enormous consequences for our lives. A student of mine once wrote in a reading response that race is real because we make it real. This is a good point. We ascribe race to others, we identify with it ourselves, and we reproduce it through our social and cultural arrangements and actions. Moreover, as the anthropologist Alan Goodman has written, racism is more real than biological race. The racial inequalities that we have talked about are very real, even if the supposed biological basis of race is not. This is a disturbing situation, and one that demands we act to change it, a demand being met today by ongoing protests against racial inequality and injustice. The good news is that because race is a cultural and social phenomenon rather than a biological one, we can change it, and we can alter the ways in which it works. Okay, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you next time.